Bombed, besieged, now under attack, the Yarmouk refugee camp in Syria. The people who live there have endured more than most in this war. But how and who can stop the attacks by ISIL? What new alliances are being forged? And is there any way to alleviate the refugees' suffering? Inside the microcosm that is Yarmouk, this is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamahl SantamariaGuests. We're talking Yarmouk today, a tiny corner of Damascus that has been in the headlines for days, but arguably should have been there for far longer. Because for almost 2 years, the Palestinian refugee camp has been under siege by the Syrian government. And the people who live there, effectively trapped with little access to food, water, electricity or outside aid. What does that look like? How about this? A photo taken by the United Nations in Yarmouk back in January of 2014. An almost endless line of people queuing for supplies they so desperately need. That was roughly 15 months ago. And now it's even worse. Fighters from ISIL have taken over large parts of the camp. Thousands of people have left. And the UN is demanding humanitarian access. It describes what's happening in Yarmouk as, quote, beyond inhumane and more desperate than ever. Now, we call it a refugee camp, but really you've got to adjust your thinking for a place like Yarmouk. These aren't rows of temporary tents. It is basically a suburb of Damascus. Have a look at the map. It's just 2 square kilometres of land, home to Palestinian refugees who fled the 1948 war. Over time, Yarmouk became a proper urban area. It has its own schools, hospitals, shops and restaurants. It even had some of the highest literacy rates in the Arab world. But that all changed when the Syrian war started. The area's been locked down by government troops, fearing the anti-government factions within could be a threat to Syria's seat of power. Not surprisingly, Yarmouk's changed a lot since the Syrian war began. Prior to 2012, around 150,000 refugees lived in the camp, but now look at the decrease. Just 18,000 are left, mainly because conditions have deteriorated so badly. Remember that description from the UN, beyond inhumane. And now with ISIL moving in, another 2,000 or so have fled Yarmouk because of growing violence and threats.
Just imagine the situation when the extremist group blared through mosques' loudspeakers that anyone who refuses to join them would be beheaded. What would you do? We had to make our way through holes in buildings. They carried me all the way out. Some holes were too small, so it was very hard for them to carry me in a wheelchair through those holes. It's really a tragic life.
So let's start today's discussion with someone who knows all about the efforts to help those living in Yarmouk. It is Pierre Krahenbuhl joining us via Skype from Amman in Jordan. He is the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, and we thank you very much for your time today. I believe you have been to Yarmouk recently, about 3 weeks ago. Tell me what it was like.
That's correct. 3 weeks ago, I visited a distribution point which UNRWA had been able to re-establish after negotiation with the Syrian government. It was resuming supplies and support in both medical terms and also in food distribution terms. What I saw were really images that were frankly unbearable in human terms. People were lining up in the queues. There was a pregnant woman who fainted, and I must say right now I'm just wondering, where is she currently with the child that she was carrying? Is she safe? How are they doing? At the same time, there was an elderly gentleman who walked up to some of our colleagues and said, "I'm hungry." And you could see the toll that has been taken by the people in Yarmouk after all these months and now years, as your earlier comments indicated. And right now, with the change of the hostilities on the ground, the intensification of the fighting, the worry is that for this very weakened population, the situation now and the tragedy that is unfolding is almost beyond belief.
Well, you've preempted my next point, and I'm glad you've done that, because you're talking about a time. Well, you've talked about both times. You talked about the time before ISIL moved in, this latest fighting, and now afterwards, which has obviously gotten a lot worse. If ISIL had not gone in, I'm wondering if we would have heard much about it. You know, the UN's using really strong language about Yarmouk, but I'm wondering if we would have even heard it if ISIL hadn't happened.
Well, to be honest, you know how it functions. There's always going to be a different span of attention for things. The photograph that you just showed earlier, which was taken during a visit by my predecessor, became an iconic image of what Yarmouk stands for and what it represents in terms of the physical destruction of the building, but also you have to imagine the psychological scars and the physical scars for the people inside Yarmouk. There was at the time huge attention around the camp. I visited 3 weeks ago, and it's true, although I did make a series of statements coming out of that visit, there was some degree of attention, but you're right, obviously not the same level as now. And we understand that, you know, there can be different moments and different times. But I think what really has to be understood for Palestinian refugees in Yarmouk, as you indicated in your earlier comments, a proud community that had established both businesses and its income was self-sufficient, was not dependent on any agency other than UNRWA for education of their children, now find themselves having to face the indignity, humiliation, but also, of course, immediate threats to their lives under the present circumstances. And this is yet another generation of Palestinians who are facing the trauma of loss of life, loss of livelihoods, and of dispossession.
And you can't get in, by you I mean the United Nations can't get in to get this humanitarian aid in. So what do you do? Who do you talk to about it? Let me read you something Chris Gunnis, one of your colleagues, tweeted the other day saying, in the strongest possible terms, UNRWA demands armed groups inside Yarmouk respect their obligations to ensure the protection of civilians. Forgive me, but I don't think ISIL will care about that. I don't think ISIL is the kind of group that will look at that and quake in their boots. So what do you do? How do you communicate with a group that doesn't communicate back with you and actually get in to look after the civilians there?
Well, I've worked for 25 years now in war zones, and what you're describing is one of the central dilemmas that we always face, is how to reach different parties to the conflict. And in this case, with the changes that have occurred, of course, it confronts UNRWA with a completely new reality on the ground in Yarmouk. So, of course, we haven't been able now to reestablish all of the types of communication lines that are at times needed to be able to reach populations, because the intensity of the fighting has just been too big and prevented us from actually
So then who do you go to then? Do you go to the Syrian government? Do you go to the PLO, any other group who has some sort of influence in Yarmouk?
Well, that's certainly what we would do. We would certainly, and have been very regularly in contact, of course, with the Syrian government, with the PLO. We have, of course, at times, for security issues, had to reach out to a number of the factions inside Yarmouk already in the past. Right now, that is not possible because of the intensity. But of course, you know, our moral and human imperative is to reach people who are in critical need. That may mean, at times, opening channels of communication with those who have an influence about whether or not you can access a given region. So we will not stop, from any measure that would allow us to reach people. But right now, just as we talk, the intensity of the fighting has just prevented us from establishing those kinds of contacts. And our message has been, I briefed yesterday in the Security Council, also to say that really every actor with influence, whether political actors, religious actors, or others, have to channel messages to all the sides and to the armed groups inside the camp. However we may think about the difficulty of that, it is a moral imperative, because whether it is from an international law point of view or a religious perspective, protecting civilians is a parameter that should be respected by all, and we will certainly continue to insist on that message.
But ultimately, just a final thought, who do you think can make a difference? Is there a group? But you talk about lots of actors there. There's got to be someone who's got to take responsibility in the end. I'll give you this. The UN obviously does a great job of maintaining the place, of looking after the place, of ultimately keeping people alive. But someone's got to do something.
Oh, I agree with you. And the point here that I find the most fundamental of all is that political action is required, because there is just no other way forward than finding a resolution to this conflict, however difficult it may look. Currently, this is just the reality. It's the only way forward. The people cannot continue year after year, month after month, living through the catastrophic consequences that the Syrian conflict has brought, of course, for Syrians, but also for Palestinians. So it is really that mobilization that is required. And I think with all the dramatic scenes that we now witness in Yarmouk, if one positive thing could come out of this tragedy, would be a more concerted international political action, then I think it would give a measure of hope in the sea of darkness that we are seeing currently.
Pierre Krahenbuhl, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, we thank you for joining us on Inside Story.
You're welcome.
Well, let's pick up on some of the points we raised there with Pierre Krahenbuhl, with our other two guests. We'll go to Malmö in Sweden to say hello to Salim Salamah. He's the head of the Palestinian League for Human Rights in Syria and someone who was actually born in Yarmouk, so he's going to give us some great insight, I hope. And in Tel Aviv, Benjamin Decker is the senior intelligence analyst for the Levantine Group, which is a risk analysis group. Gentlemen, thank you both for your time. Salim, I would like to start with you. Tell me your memories of Yarmouk. Tell us a bit of a story about when you left and what you remember of it.
I think Yarmouk, as one of the biggest settlement of the Palestinian diaspora in the outside the occupied territories outside Palestine, it's my memories are still actually very rich. It's a vibrant economic, culture and political neighborhood in the outskirt of Damascus, although it is very much within Damascus. The outskirt is not extremely an accurate description of it. Yarmouk is where the political landscape of Palestine manifested in all its richness and its livelihood. I have, in fact, I have pretty much a lot of memories about the manifestation of the Palestinian identity over there, about the manifestation of the discourse of homeland, the discourse of the right of the return, the discourse of the memories of the 1948 Nakba. So it's pretty much a place where we were connected to Palestine and where we were reminded always of our homeland.
And so in that time, and I'm talking before 2012, before this Syrian government siege came into place, it operated like you described. It's a suburb of Damascus, effectively, and people could go about their lives, and there was its own economy. Can you tell us, I guess from the contacts you still have there, how has it operated under siege? How does a bakery get hold of flour to make food for people? How does a hospital get hold of medical supplies to treat people when it's under siege from the Syrian government?
In fact, they did not get hold of things. They got hold only of hope that kept them going in the last 2 years. Apart from that, they were always hopeful when they went to the regime checkpoint in the northern exit of Yarmouk, which is under the control of the Syrian regime leadership. They were always counting on the hope that the mood of the checkpoint in that day will allow them to have access to flour, will allow them to have access to urgent medical needs. They will allow them to have access to basics that they need to survive. In fact, those were extremely difficult 2 years that our calls fell into deaf ears during them. We have worked extensively on the Palestinian League for Human Rights to document the casualties resulted in this siege. And then with our colleagues in Amnesty International, we have managed to document 200 names of people who were starved to death by the Syrian regime. So basically, people, in fact, did not have access to anything. People had access to hope, had access to their desire or their aspiration that the international community will interact with their demands. Unfortunately, this was not the case. Since September 2014, there is no water in Yarmouk. And since more than 700 days, there is no electricity. Of course, not to mention the crisis situation in terms of medical supplies.
Okay, Benjamin Decker in Tel Aviv, let me bring you in. Something Salim said there resonated with me. He talked about things falling upon deaf ears. Why do you think that is? And I don't like saying this, but has Yarmouk become, quote unquote, another one of those refugee problems which people hear about for a little while and there's outrage for a little while and then it falls off the radar again?
Unfortunately, this is by and large the case in conflict zones. I myself have personally spent time with an NGO that I founded in the Zaatari refugee camp for Syrian refugees in northern Jordan. And by and large, the online fundraising and crowd raising that we did was very difficult to get people to understand the critical importance of supporting these communities, particularly in the patchwork war of Syria, where you have ISIS propaganda dominating the media waves, as well as Jabhat al-Nusra's recent gains, of which the Western media is often referring to as al-Qaeda's takeover of Syria. And pardon my French, but this is a much sexier story than the plight of refugee communities.
Well, you've raised two interesting groups there which I wanted to talk about. One is ISIL and one is the Nusra Front. So let's talk about that, Benjamin. Who let ISIL in? I don't get this, that the Syrian government can have a place like Yarmouk under siege and effectively under lockdown, and suddenly, out of nowhere, ISIL's in there. How did it happen?
So this all began after a Hamas social activist was murdered early last week. Very quickly, Akhnaf Beit al-Maqdis, a Palestinian group affiliated with Hamas, had accused ISIL of carrying out the assassination, and in response, they abducted several local ISIL commanders in the area. This led ISIL to very quickly raid the camp, initially taking in several areas. Very briefly, they were repelled by a group including Akhnaf Beit al-Maqdis and the PFLP. However, since the weekend, we have seen ISIS take over at least 95% of the territory. When it comes to the checkpoints in particular, very early on, Jabhat al-Nusra had issued a statement claiming neutrality in the incident. However, from local Syrian activist contacts that I have, they have claimed that the Nusra Front actually allowed for ISIL men to enter the camp. At the same time, the same sources have indicated that Jabhat al-Nusra has actually prevented PFLP, Akhnaf Beit al-Maqdis, and other Palestinian groups from entering the camp to attempt to repel ISIL.
So could I stretch it even further and suggest some sort of complicity, tacit or otherwise, between the Assad regime and between ISIL or Nusra? Because, again, for them to have it locked down for so long, you got to wonder how it all suddenly changes.
Of course, particularly in reference to ISIL, the Assad regime has had several tacit agreements, largely unspoken, particularly when it comes to the transport and shipping of goods, as well as the purchasing of black market oil. In the southern Damascus environs in particular, almost a year ago to date, forces loyal to the Assad regime, including Hezbollah, were fighting both ISIL and the Nusra Front in the Kalamun region bordering the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. And during this time, ISIL completely revamped their militant deployments to southern areas along the outskirts of Damascus, particularly in Hajar al-Aswad, which is very close to the Yarmouk refugee camp. In that time, the regime has continued to fight a myriad of moderate rebel groups in eastern areas of the city. And in this sense, the Assad regime has purportedly paid tolls to ISIL checkpoints along the M5 highway, which stretches all the way from Dara in the south to Aleppo in the north.
Salim, let me bring you back to the conversation. I saw you nodding there when I started to talk about, possible complicity. Give me your thoughts on how all these groups knit together, the government, ISIL, the Palestinian groups, Nusra Front, all these groups together.
In fact, Kamahl, I don't have an analysis of the scene, as this is not my area of expertise.
Sure.
But rather than I have a question actually that I raise. I share with you that it is put towards the Syrian officials that a camp where 200 people were starved to death, and a camp where all the entrances are locked down since 2 years, where hardly air can get in. How suddenly hundreds or maybe thousands of fighters of the Islamic State are found inside it? This is a question, I think, that is put forward for the Syrian regime to answer.
Okay, not just the Syrian regime. Can I bring in the PLO as well, the Palestine Liberation Organization? Because technically, they are the ones who are supposed to oversee and look after Palestinian refugees wherever they are, the diaspora around the Middle East. Should they be stepping in somehow, or is really the PLO just too weak to deal with this sort of thing?
I think the PLO is meant to be the only legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. However, it's not their role to secure the security of the Palestinian camps all over the world. This is practically not possible. But in terms of their role, or in terms of their symbolic importance for us as Palestinian refugees, we believe that as Palestinian League for Human Rights, we believe that this is a very rare moment in the history of the Syrian popular movement, when the Palestinian Liberation Organization can have a very meaningful intervention on our behalf to protect our rights and to promote them and to lobby for a ceasefire or for a durable solution, long-term durable solution for this crisis. Definitely.
The PLO has not excelled itself when showing strength, whether it be in the any troubles with Hamas or with the Israelis or anything. The PLO has shown itself to be a fairly weak group, and you would think up against the Syrian regime and ISIL, I mean, what chance would it have?
I think the strength or the weakness of the PLO in this regard is not our main concern. Our main concern is that is there a political will within the leadership of the PLO or there is no political will. The question of negotiating a way out of this crisis is always feasible. I think the problem is the absence of the political will by all parties. And it's not only about whether the PLO has a word over the Syrian regime or whether the PLO has the strength or does not have the strength. The political will can create a form of strength, I believe. So this is what we are still waiting from the Palestinian leadership to see.
Benjamin, your thoughts on that?
I think it's very important, the statements that Salim made, because in reality, Yarmouk right now is the victim of a much larger play by ISIL to enter southern parts of the country. Following the Jabhat al-Nusra's major offensive into the Dara and Quneitra provinces, ISIL has slowly crept more and more in an effort to carve out a space for themselves. And in regard to the power play at the moment, I think the regime, by launching several rounds of barrel bombs within the Yarmouk camp over the past several days, has really played its hand, indicating that it far prefers territorial control over addressing humanitarian issues, particularly in the capital, where control of the entrance and exit roads, particularly some of the highways such as the M5, is far more important than dealing with humanitarian issues.
But what does ISIL or Nusra Front or any of these groups really have to gain from overrunning and attacking a refugee camp? I know there are factions within there and there's political things at play here, but really we're talking about an area of people who have been displaced once. They live their life in very difficult circumstances, and I wonder really what ISIL's play is, and al-Nusra Front, particularly in Yarmouk.
I think in particular there has to be a separation between ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra. We have seen the groups actually fighting alongside one another in areas of the Kalamun Mountains bordering the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. There was a very significant ambush operation in August 2014 in Arsul, and the two groups together continue to hold 25 Lebanese servicemen hostage. When it comes to Yarmouk in particular, given that there are a lack of goods, a lack of people, and a largely destroyed area, my understanding is that this is largely a military operation intent on carving out additional areas within southern Damascus. I think that there may have been a wrongful assumption on their part that they could hide under the guise of a refugee camp in hopes of not being targeted by aerial bombardment operations. However, we have seen that is by and large not the case. I think the biggest question really is how will Jabhat
Benjamin, let me
al-Nusra
interrupt you just quickly because we're running out of time, and I just saw Salim shaking his head there. Salim, a quick reply from you before we go.
I mean, I think honestly, like they are trying to cover in a refugee camp. I mean, we have seen the Syrian regime in the last 4 years. They bomb any area regardless of how densely it is populated, regardless of how many civilians are left there. And this is well documented by international organizations. So I think the fact that ISIS invaded Yarmouk because they thought that the regime is not going to bomb them, excuse me, but this makes no sense at all. I think it is part of their strategic desire to expand their control over the camp. This operation might have been planned since months, and it is not the outcome of just a normal clash or a desire that came to their mind of invading Yarmouk. I think this is a way more complicated issue that we need to reflect upon more with time.
It's complicated, it's fascinating, it is ultimately very sad. We thank you both for your time, Salim Salamah and Benjamin Decker, joining us on Inside Story. And thank you as well for joining us for another edition of Inside Story. 3 ways to get in touch with us. You can go straight to our program's page at aljazeera.com. You can post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story, or straight to me at Kamahl AJ. It's great to have you with us, and we hope to see you again soon. From the whole team, goodbye for now.